With South Africa and the wider continent navigating the shifting trade tariffs, and that America also kind of adding this new sphere into this trade conversation, and the continent looking for new partners. How does this conference cater to that conversation?
Okay, I think let's start from the current positions that are happening. I think one, there's a misconception that there's a global shift on tariffs and everything. No, it's an American shift. It's not a global one. So you see, post-colonial global markets, everything that came into conversations was political. So embassies were conduits of political discourse. But in this current time, things have changed. Example of the embassy of the UAE, it was once a 60-40, which was 60 political, 40 economic. Now it's 80-20. It's 80 economic and 20 political. Why? Because we've now become the conduits for business as opposed to being gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to get an understanding of a country's market, the point of contact in your country is going to be the embassy.
Recently, the Minister of Small Businesses and Development came out and said entrepreneurs are not interested in being part of the lawmaking process. How do you feel about that as an entrepreneur yourself?
You see, this conversation of the youth, there was an argument that we had with some colleagues in my academic days about whether or not the fact that we are the most youthful continent will be a blessing or it will be the biggest resource cut we can ever have as a continent. The way things are looking, it's going to the resource cut perspective.
Okay, welcome to another episode of From Garage to Growth. I'm your host, Brian, and on this episode, we're going to talk and kind of look at an event that's coming up in September, which is the Embassies Business Fair and Conference. So to help me kind of explore this conference, I am joined by Jacob.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this very good podcast. My name is Jacob. I'm currently the economic advisor to the ambassador of the UAE in South Africa.
So with South Africa and the wider continent navigating the shifting trade tariffs, and America also kind of adding this new sphere into this trade conversation, and the continent looking for new partners, how does this conference cater to that conversation? And how does it help with regards to curating new partners for people seeking out partners?
Okay, I think let's start from the current positions that are happening. I think one, there's a misconception that there's a global shift on tariffs and everything. No, it's an American shift. It's not a global one. And because of that, it doesn't mean the engagements that have been there over a period of time are actually getting diminished. But what is very important at this current stage is the fact that there's been an Africa-centric shift on the continent. We've had a movement of Africa being the center point for a lot of economic and trade engagements lately, because guess what? It's the youngest continent. One, it has the most resources, and these are facts. And most importantly, also on top of that, it is the least diminished when it comes to our resources. Yes, it's been abused over a period of time, but we still have the most resources in diversity. Now, the potential is very big. So when everything runs out everywhere, everybody now turns and looks at Africa as the next step. But from an embassy perspective, coming from the embassy, we've had a pivot away from talking about tariffs and everything to opening up spaces where people can actually do business. I think if you had to look at a country that opens up for business, it's the UAE. Taxes are pretty much close to zero. They've opened up their space as rich as they are with very heavy reliance on oil. Lately, it is just 25% of the economic outlook at the moment. Why? Because they opened up their spaces for business. So what platforms like the Embassy Fair bring to us is this. One, it allows countries like the UAE that are not African to show Africans the opportunities for export, the opportunities for markets that are closer to them that they can use as conduits to get to the greater market that is the growing or the developing markets, which are now becoming the bigger consumers of African goods. And then for African countries that participate, it creates a platform for South African companies, and I want to be quite specific on this one, to explore synergies with other African countries. Because there's a misconception of the silos structures that are here. Everybody thinks, you know what, all business has to be in your country, but you don't think about considering collaborations and partnerships cross-border. And for Africans, you have to be a major like MTN or ABSA or this to go across the continent. No, even the smaller companies that are seen as micro companies or small and mediums in South Africa, in certain economies in the African continent, they're bigger. So these are platforms that allow for them to understand the African market, because there's, of course, African embassies opening up to them and saying, listen, this is the regulations, this is the opportunities, these are the investment opportunities, which in South Africa may be very small. In other countries, they might actually be big. So it opens up that exposure and closes the chasm in the silos that have been there over a period of time. So for African countries, it's the global market. And for South African companies, it's the African market and then the global market, with the different embassies that are actually coming and platforming themselves within this engagement.
You spoke about this creating synergies between the African market and businesses moving around. And embassies are generally known for their bureaucratic culture. And the business space within Africa, it's known for its bureaucratic culture. And how do these two synergize together to form this happy marriage?
So you see, post-colonial global markets, everything that came into conversations was political. So embassies were conduits of political discourse. But in this current time, things have changed. Example of the embassy of the UAE, it was once a 60-40, which was 60 political, 40 economic. Now it's 80-20. It's 80 economic and 20 political. Why? Because we've now become the conduits for business as opposed to being gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wanted to get an understanding of a country's market, the point of contact in your country is going to be the embassy, because they will be able to give you the understanding of the modes. That's why you have trade commissioners or what they call trade attaches and economic attaches in these embassies. We've now stopped from being the people stopping people and just because we're the ones giving visas and stuff, to being the ones to say, listen, my friend, you want to do business? I will help you walk the journey with you. I will explain to you where the right agencies are for you to do your registration. I will tell you who the right ministries are for you to talk to. And if you want to set up these people who we have been able to engage with from all the different trade and investment events that these embassies are now collating or they are organizing of late, to say, listen, we are all open for business. It's no longer about politics. It's about people-to-people relationships and also business to business. And if you understand business, it's not about politics. It's about making money and also growing areas and being able to mutually sustain each other. And that is, I think, the reasoning behind these engagements. We've now come from being the goalkeepers or the gatekeepers to being the agents and agencies for the countries to open the markets, and vice versa.
And what mechanisms have you kind of put in place? Was the goal for this conference that's coming up is for you guys to create a space where people can go collaborate, communicate, build this relationship to help them go forward. So how do you go about actually creating platforms or creating situations where people can actually network, can actually go beyond just the South African market? Or if I want to go to Nigeria, for example, their business, how are you guys conduiting that relationship between, like, let's say, the South African embassy and the Nigerian embassy?
So of course you're going to another market. The first point of contact is going to be that embassy, right? The embassy of that market. So what it means effectively, like from platforms like the Embassy Fair, is that these embassies through their trade offices are going to be there to express the opportunities that are there in those markets, but also help the companies that are interested in understanding how to get around registering in those markets and what to look out for. So the first point of contact for any business would be go to the Nigerian embassy and say, listen, I want to open up in Nigeria. The Nigerian trade attaché will sit you down and tell you, listen, this is what we do. This is what we have. What opportunities, what sector are you looking at? They'll be like, you know what? This is the sector I'm looking at. Then they're like, okay, fine, no problem. Are you looking to invest? Are you looking to look for partners? Because if I have to send it into the other side, I have to understand what you're looking out for so that I can give you the right direction. And it's now more of a partnership engagement as opposed to the bureaucracies that are usually there. For us, it's very simple. If you want to invest in the UAE, you come to us, we'll ask you, listen, what are you looking for? They tell you, listen, I'm looking for this specific sector. We'll tell you, listen, here is the sector requirements. This is what you need for you to open up a business. That is what you should engage. And in certain spaces where people are saying, listen, I want to go, but I'm looking for a strategic partner. Then we say, listen, we'll engage some of the chambers there to see if there would be partners that could actually be able to engage with you. Because what happens is that the embassy collects the information, passes it on to the ministries and the chambers, because this is business, to say, listen, this is a company that is coming in. Do you have any partners that can actually be able to synergize with? But most importantly for us, we are platforms as embassies to expose the market and also help whoever is interested from a business perspective to build their business for that market or prepare themselves to get into the market. Yeah.
Okay. So the other thing is, let's say I'm a small business in the township and this conference is presented to me. But as we mentioned, some people within the African ecosystem feel like these conferences or moving across markets are only for curated companies, which is like the MTNs, the larger companies. How do we break that stigma of letting everyone else feel like, hey, there's opportunity beyond where you are located?
So having participated in the one last year, there were three things that happened. One, there is a flow for the small businesses to actually come and set up stalls and expose their businesses. Remember, you're dealing with embassies. The embassies are bringing a lot of people to actually check the businesses out and everything. So it allows for them to have exposure of their products to different countries through the embassies, because that's the platform that is given. But secondly, there's also, it's not just embassies that participate. There's other key stakeholders that participate. Last year, we had Access Bank that was part of it, and I think they're still participating this year. We had the National Development Fund there. They had representatives that even talked. We had the small business department that was part of this conversation. And that means that the key stakeholders that are part of the ecosystem that will allow you to grow are also there. The ones that you could not be able to expose yourself to then, you can now ask them the critical questions. How can I get access to financing if I have this product? But remember that one of the problems that we have with our small businesses, especially in the townships, many of them are unregistered, right? And many of them, because they're unregistered, they don't also get exposure to understanding export licensing and making sure that they're export ready. The other thing is that because of the lack of exposure, the products may not actually be large market ready. And last year, I was part of the panel for the key businesses. There was a panel that analyzed about 20 to 30 key businesses that were looked at for next levels. As part of this platform, they allow for small businesses looking for funding and partnerships to actually put in their registrations to be a part of this engagement, to engage key stakeholders who can analyze whether or not they can invest in them. Something akin to what you can see on the shacks. And I was honored to be part of that panel. And one of the key problems that we found was you find a lot of very good small businesses, but they are not well structured. So they've not been mentored into understanding how they can get structured. They're not registered. They're not export ready. They have very good products. And somehow there is a misconception that their products are only meant for the small market they're in. And yet, here you are, you have a diverse panel that has people from other countries who are saying that product would actually be a very good solution in my country. But for you to do that, sort your local issue out of making sure you get your books in order, and then we can talk about getting you partners on the other side so that you don't feel like you're losing something. So for me, the exposure is important. And even if you don't have ready products that you can bring, at least come and participate and network. Network with the different countries. You'll realize that the small product that you think is a small product, because in the township it's failing to sell, may be a very good product in another market because that is what they're looking for. So it's exposure to market.
Yeah. So we spoke about exposure to market. There's this other conversation that happens within the African space with regards to African-made products and the sellability to other African markets, where people will either buy alternatives that are made outside the African ecosystem, but they want to invest in the African-made product. How do we break that stigma?
Now, this one is an answer from an African perspective. One, I feel like this whole African-made product situation is a very terrible misconception because of a few things. One, you can't force products onto people. That's a problem with markets. Markets are actually competitive. For you to want people to buy African-made products, the first thing has to be quality of product, right? Quality of product so that it can be good for market. Because if you say that it's not being bought, MTN is an African company. It's an African product. You understand? So if you can benchmark off good quality products, even if they're coming from another market, people will buy. The second thing is the ecosystem. The ecosystem that is around the product that you're creating. A lot of people want to run to duplicate and replicate products that are already in the market. But you're not going to make a car in Africa that can be cheaper than a car in China when you know that the actual raw materials are going to use to make this car coming from China. So you're pretty much coming in from a very, very difficult perspective. But you can create a solution for your country, a solution in your market that is specific to you. It's Africa made, but if it's quality, then you don't even need to do too much. People will buy. The one thing I like about South African products is they're African made, but they're also quality products that are in line with the global quality standards. Now, if you want me to buy an African-made product, give me the quality that is the same as the quality I would have gotten from another product, because then you won't even need to tell me it's African. I will buy it because it's not only African, but it's the same quality as what I'm looking for. But in Africa, we have a problem. We like duplicating. You find a product that has been brought at X amount of money. You want to duplicate it because you think that by starting this business, you're going to cut costs. But the thing is, if you're starting it and you're building it and you're creating it, you forget that the cost of business is also benchmarked on the raw materials you're going to use to make that product. And then when people don't buy it, you start saying, no, you guys are anti-African. You don't want to buy local. You don't want, no, my friend, we want to buy local, but we want to buy quality of local. Because if you're going to give me what I want, you give it to me at the quality I want it. So the best way for us to do it is this. We know the problem that we have. You want us to bring manufacturing back or production back to Africa. Let's invest in the ecosystem. Much of the raw material is here. We actually export it. So let's invest in the ecosystem. But if we're investing in the ecosystem, the people making the product need to acknowledge the fact that they have to make sure that the product that they make is not only quality, but at the same time, it makes business sense because it has to come to, you can make a high quality product in Africa, but it's too expensive. You understand? Same quality as another product, but it's too expensive. Why? Because your raw materials are a little bit too much. You cut that raw material cost down, then you're able to actually be able to compete in the market. So that is how I look at it. It's not the fact that we don't want African-made products, but we want quality product, not duplicated products. Because then you're going to come to me and then say, oh no, Jacob, me as O'Brien, I feel like you're unfair because you don't want to buy African-made. No, I want to buy good quality products, right?
True.
Exactly.
Yeah, because you want value for your money
as well. Yeah.
And so we've touched quite on a lot of issues where Africa is all this potential, all these raw materials, but we still sit with the issue of exporting all these raw materials. Where does the conference like this come in where we can shift the conversation around bringing back manufacturing, using our raw materials to create our own finished products, actually quality products?
What happens is that a conference like this creates a platform for some conversations to be done for more exposure to a system that we can actually be able to work with. Now, let's talk about the raw material conversation. You know, sometimes people are always fighting about the situation of we export too much, we export raw materials. But please understand, we need to always put it in context of our history, right? This century is a century where we've had the least amount of wars on the African continent. That effectively means that for the last part of the last century, where we were colonized, then we had to go out of colonialism and then start our own stuff. Remember that the colonial system was a system that had been created for export of raw materials to the countries that were our colonial masters who could actually be able to value add those raw materials. So when we took over that system, it was an ecosystem that worked for us because it brought capital easily, right? Over this period of time. Now, over this time, we've realized that we're losing more money because we don't have capacity to value add. But before we start shouting about the fact that we are over-exporting raw materials, let's be realistic about our history as Africans, right? So now that we know where we've come from, now what is the next step? It's about systems thinking. We need to actually be able to realign our systems to building the entire value chain. Have an ecosystem for this raw material. But again, an ecosystem that is competitive enough for the guy who has been exporting his raw material to sell it locally, right? Like the value propositioning has to make sense. Now, in Africa, we want to export. We want to export quality products. But again, if I'm going to sell it locally, even if you put a law that I have to sell it locally, and I'm not going to get my money's worth, I will not sell it locally. I will always find a way of exporting it because that's where my value is. So the ecosystem has to be supported by some very, very good, key stakeholders have to play a role. Number one, government has to play a role from a regulatory perspective, a tariff perspective, allowing for local entrepreneurs and local investors to invest in part of the ecosystem that will allow for value addition. Because we're now out of the century of talking. It's about implementation, right? The second thing we need to look at is the value addition we're doing. Who is the market, right? Because if we value add, who is going to be the market if the guys who was taking it last time were saying, no, we don't want to touch it, right? And this is where the Africanization, the inward looking of African countries comes in. One, African countries can be markets from a cross-border perspective, but also they can be part of that value addition from an ecosystems perspective. Simplest example, which is the most industrialized country on the continent? South Africa, right? Which is also the biggest mining heavy country? South Africa. We already have ecosystems that value add, but they're struggling with the raw materials to value add. If you go to DRC, we do a bilateral transaction with them that says, listen, for all the copper that you're bringing, bring it down. We have an iron ore smelter that is about to close because Accelerators does not want to do business in South Africa anymore. It does not make business sense. How about you come value add from South Africa and then you sell it from here? Because guess what? We also have ports. You understand? So instead of having internal local ecosystems, we can then do cross-border ecosystems. We utilize the fact that there's strengths in different countries that we can piggyback off as African brothers and say, listen, if I can use a smelter in South Africa to actually smelt my copper and value add, when we sell it, there's a shared value that we're getting from there because what we're selling is now a finished product. If I have to move oil from Angola and I'm going to move it as a raw material, as crude oil, but then South Africa has 7 refineries that are closed, how about we do a deal with them and say, listen, bring the oil here. Let's refine it here and then sell it inward again. So then that allows us to have that ecosystem that makes sense. But we cannot just talk about African continental free trade and wait for tariff disbursements and then look at this and look at that. No, we just have to have real serious, reasonable, sustainable solutions because then it's easy for us to continue that conversation. The raw material situation can be both local, but it can also be regional. For me, I believe that is the aspect we've not used. And that is the aspect I really want them to tap.
And you've touched on something I want to touch on is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This thing that was brought in to bring up this borderless market within the African continent. In your take, being in the space, do you feel like this thing has actually worked as it was promised? Or is it still in the process of kind of working? What's your take on it?
For starters, it worked. And I'll tell you why. By the time, I remember in 2014, in my master's class, we were having this conversation. And at that time, everyone knew African continental free trade will never happen. Why? There was no political will to even sign it off because everyone had their own little interests as Africans. But the fact that we have an entire continent of countries that has signed off on a transaction is already a very big tick. We have to first acknowledge that bit. Practically, let's think about it. The problem with politics is this. You can politically talk about some things, but like any commercial transactions or any economy, the laws and regulations are always reactive. They are not proactive. You will never find laws that are proactive. It's the same thing as how you have cryptocurrency laws. Like they're struggling to get them into the space because they're trying to understand the market. But this business of cross-border transactioning has been there on the African continent for a very long time. The issue is now entrenching it into practical levels of engagement to say, listen, now we're seeing what's going on. How can we make this more seamless? If the rules are not working, this is when innovation comes in. Now we have cross-border transaction from a fintech perspective. We have the Mama Moneys and Mokurus doing some very big transactions. I have a colleague of mine who has another one called OneGate, payment systems that are cross-border. And they're cross-border and cross-currency. So they are now way above what the regulations are. Now you've given us a platform. By them agreeing from a political perspective, they've given the African innovators and entrepreneurs a platform to think and expedite this by bringing everything that will be allowing for seamless transactioning. It's not going to come from the rules. You're not going to wake up in the morning and hear the president of South Africa saying, listen, South Africa is open for business. It's borderless. You can walk in and walk out. No, but it doesn't mean that there's no cross-border transactions going on every day. It doesn't need government to say something. It's a business-to-business and people-to-people engagement that is happening. Because we know 54 countries are not going to wake up in the morning and say, listen, we all agree with the cross-border movement of immigration just like that, right? But remember that lately, there's countries who have come out and said, listen, Africans are visa-free. You can come to our country anytime. You don't need visas. If 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 countries start doing it, it now becomes a norm. So whether you want to waive it or not, you then start realizing that, albeit the Abahambe situation in South Africa, it's not stopped Africans from coming and doing business in South Africa. We know what we're getting ourselves into. These are our brothers. We know them. We've done businesses. And also, it has not stopped African businesses from going across. So for me, it's a key stakeholder conversation from a private sector perspective than a government perspective. I don't think there's going to be policies that are going to be quick enough to turn it around, but we've learned our lessons. Yeah. And thankfully, we are in, as I said, remember we had wars in the last century. Now we are in a century that actually makes sense for Africans, because now building of businesses and the ecosystems are actually becoming a bit faster, and technology adoption has been the fastest on the African continent.
And so the lawmaking process is a process that's always part of the journey of an entrepreneur. Yeah. And recently, the Minister of Small Businesses and Development came out and said entrepreneurs are not interested in being part of the lawmaking process. You know, how do you feel about that as an entrepreneur yourself? And how do you shift the conversation where you actually bring in founders or people in the grassroots in the townships to be part of the conversation in terms of going like, oh, you guys are not interested in kind of involving yourselves in the lawmaking process?
So the problem with entrepreneurs is this: 99% of your time is invested in your business. That 1% is in your family, right? Now, if you want to add another percentage that cracks right through to deal with laws, a lot of entrepreneurs are going to be like, my friend, how am I going to survive? But at the same time, let's be realistic, right? You're telling us that you want us to make laws or be part of the public participation. I think many of the entrepreneurs are going to be like, but the realities of what I want, will they be part of the final document? I think people have been disillusioned by that bit, because you will come in and have the right conversations and say, listen, as an entrepreneur, this is what I feel needs to be done, but it's not populist enough. So when it goes to the final white paper, will they consider my input? And I think because people have been engaged in that from a public participation perspective, entrepreneurs have decided, you know what, we are going to focus on our own stuff. We'll build our business. And unfortunately, because of that, at a time where the ministers that we have, especially for small business, are saying, listen, I'm here to listen to you guys. Help me help you. The entrepreneurs are like, no, we're tired. We've been waiting. And remember that many of the entrepreneurs who might want to participate, especially founders, in your entrepreneurship journey, what level are you at? You understand? Do you have enough capacity for you to sit down and say, listen, I understand the rules myself? And FYI, even the entrepreneurs don't even know the laws. You can agree, oh, Brian, you're an entrepreneur, you know that. If I asked you basic rules that you may need for you to run your business more successfully, it's a problem. But the participation, I love the fact that we now have a minister who is ready to listen. So yes, as much as I've made a very big excuse for entrepreneurs, I would like to ask that if entrepreneurs you know your problems better. You know your problems better. It's better you engage her and be like, listen, we get you want us to tell you the laws, but this is the thing. If we're going to do it, they have to be pro-entrepreneurship as opposed to this. But also remember that as much as entrepreneurs are coming in to help with the laws, big business is also coming in to make sure that these guys don't mess with their business. And then big business is like, my friend, if you pass that, I'm closing my business and you're going to lose 500 people from working here, because it doesn't make business sense.
There's a shift within Africa with places like Tunisia where there's a whole startup act around how to start a startup. Do you see that happening across Africa where more countries are implementing startup acts?
Yes, it's, African countries have a trend where people start making too much noise, they react with something. As I said, laws are very reactionary. It's about whether or not people are actually saying, listen, we need laws that will actually push this conversation. So if you're going to build the infrastructure that allows the ecosystem for startups, for unicorns to actually grow, you cannot just do it by law. You have to not only create the law, but create the ecosystem that allows for these startups to actually get the right growth trajectory. So simplest example, South Africa doesn't necessarily have a startup act, but it has an ecosystem that has been there, that has allowed for the 10 banks of this world, the Capitex of this world, because that ecosystem is there. Of course, it's big money and it's big capital, but it's there. Now, just creating a regulation and saying, listen, well, yeah, we'll create a startup law that gives you the guidelines, but who is going to teach me how to make sure I implement this guideline? Where am I going to get the funding? What are going to be the prerequisites I need if I have to go to a funder? Is government putting a fund on the side to support the startups? I think for me, thank you very much for the startup laws, but are you also going to help me have the enablers that are going to be able to allow me to get the implementation? I think that's a critical question that I always have.
Yeah.
Yes, we can have the startup laws. It's amazing, good, but it's the same thing as having company laws, right? As a lawyer, I understand the law is nice. That's where some of us make money from. But it does not necessarily mean that it's going to grow a founder of a company who says, listen, I've been able to put X amount of money here. I cannot get access to funding to get me to market. Or I have a very good idea. It is a solution to a problem that we have in the country. I've pitched it to a couple of private banks, but I can't get that money because I don't qualify for that funding. Who can I pitch it to from a government perspective? Because this is a social solution that can allow me to then, one, get mentored, but also build it to a point that I can go to market where I can get access to the capital that these private funders are bringing. You can't just create laws. You need the ecosystem that supports those laws. And that is the one thing we don't have in Africa.
And the other thing, how do we diversify our startup sectors? Was the fintech gets all the funding within the African context? How do other sectors kind of become attractive, like agrotech, health? How do we kind of grow those sectors into the same level of funding that the fintech sector has been getting in the continent?
By bringing solutions that make sense and adoptable. Because the thing is, the reason why people don't put money in certain sectors, people put money in fintech because they know it's plug and play, you get some money out. But at the same time, it's created a big misconception. Misconception of, oh no, it's fintech, so you're pulling money, you're going to be in cryptocurrency, you want to create a platform for cryptocurrency trading, a platform for cross-border transactioning, a platform for this. So it's very palatable to European and global financiers because they understand that market.
Yeah.
It's an easy thing. And also that is how you start getting, the unicorns of this world. But agri-tech is very specific. If the market that you're doing it for does not believe that this thing is sustainable, it won't work. And yet when you have people who are bringing solutions that make sense, they're easily adoptable. I have a young man, he's a friend of the embassy. He had an agri-tech solution, but for him, he understood in South Africa, if you start bringing some agri-tech stuff, it may not work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an agriculture platform that allows for smallholder farmers to get access to market. Bring solutions, don't duplicate things. And that's the problem we have with a lot of the other sectors. And the thing is, not everything has to be AI-driven, AI this, AI that. Like, guys, please, guys.
Tell me about it, man. Tell me about it.
Yesterday, I was reading something, and what people don't know is the wealthiest 1% that you don't know about are the guys who are doing the most basic of solutions. We have countries where we have issues with recycling, basic recycling, right? But you want to invest in an AI app that recycles. It doesn't work like that. But you'll have a guy who will create a solution to get the recycling going. So now you're creating a new ecosystem. That ecosystem creates new raw materials that go into the value chain. And then that's where the value addition is. But then you're doing an ESG job, which is a good solution for the climate. And now, if that guy walks into a pitch, would you listen to the AI guy? Would you listen to this guy? Do you understand what I mean? We have a problem. We have a problem with potholes. You create a solution for that, a small solution. It doesn't have to be, no, locate where the pothole is. No, I want the solution to make sure that I can easily turn over. If I see a pothole today, I can just tag it, get someone to actually fill it within the next 24 hours, and it's gone. It's cost cutting, but serious solutions for the problems that we have. It's not a plug and play. Don't get the European stuff and then bring it to Africa. No, we know our African problems. Let's invest in our own solutions and then make sense. But if you duplicate, we're not creating an ecosystem. The fintechs will still make money because guess what? Africa has the fastest adoption of tech globally. We were the fastest to take on the mobile phones. We've been the fastest to go digital and all that stuff. But it does not necessarily mean that just because we're in that phase, everything has to be fintech, AI, this. No. We have to also think about the fundamentals that we are looking at. Like, if we know that we are agriculture heavy, How can we create solutions for smallholder farmers that they don't have to worry about getting the basic implements now, but they can be able to say, listen, I'm going to call these guys. They can be able to not only give me funding for my next season, but they can also bring the implements like small tractors that can actually help me till the land, do the stuff. It cuts cost for me. And it also allows me to then say, you know what, when I want to sell, they've given me a platform to sell my product. Now that is a solution for an African farmer, right? But if you want to tell me that you want to do everything in tech, fine, go for it. But don't then be frustrated by financing because you feel your solution is not being taken up. It's because the market is saturated by similar products. So how are they going to grow if they're all the same and duplicating as opposed to creating solutions? You need to stand out in this market.
And we've touched on a lot of things, the potential within the continent, our resources, add value to our products. There's one resource that we have, and this is youth capital. And it's one that we are not tapping into correctly, was we still boast some of the largest unemployment across the board. South Africa, for example, 60% are youth unemployment. How do we fix this crisis that's looming within the continent?
You see, this conversation of the youth, there was an argument that we had with some colleagues in my academic days about whether or not the fact that we are the most youthful continent will be a blessing or it will be the biggest resource curse we can ever have as a continent. Now, where things are looking, it's going to the resource curse perspective. These two problems that we have in Africa. We have countries where education is very, very high. So people are highly educated. The basic benchmark is degrees, and there are too many of them. And government is the smaller employer, right? Then you have people in South Africa where the education may not be too high, but the youth unemployment is growing because of the historical aspects of the situation. But most importantly, government still being the biggest employer is now struggling to sustain their capacity. Now, my request is this. If government could be smart enough to get money and invest it in entrepreneurs that have bankable, scalable solutions that will take in employment, it will save just a bit of the issue. And this is cross-cutting. And secondly, from a private sector perspective, programs that can be able to create young people who are able to sustain themselves from an entrepreneurial perspective, but at the same time, with a caveat to this conversation, guys, O'Brien, not all of us are entrepreneurs. Not all of us are innovators. Some people are just good at being good employees. Some people are very good at being good entrepreneurs. And usually sometimes that line is very blurred. When people are having a problem being able to get access to capital or being able to be employed, they are forced to become entrepreneurs. But it does not necessarily mean that they're there. Now, this goes back to what we talked about financing. If we have catalytic sectors that we know are human capital heavy, why doesn't government invest in companies that take up large human capital and say, listen, we're investing in you through the PIC. Now, I'm giving this African aspect because it's a more structured, area. So PIC goes and says, listen, we know that this sector is critical. Now, I'll invest in these companies that will then be able to expand, take on more employees. But I know that the resource that they use needs more employees. So the entire value chain is empowered by the expansion plans of this one, company. And then you do that in critical catalytic sectors, and then it builds capacity. Now, secondly, it's the change in the way we do our education. We are more theoretical and less technical. So you are investing in youth who are more of, let's go to the phone and try to figure out what ChatGPT is going to say about something, and that's the theory, as opposed to putting them there into the system and saying, listen, go down and actually pretty much unplug an entire engine and put it back. Why? Because even within our education system, not all of us are going to be academics. No, we are not. But it doesn't mean that we're not geniuses, or it doesn't mean that we don't know what we're doing. Some people, practical people want to actually be down and get things done, and they pick up better when they're practical about it. But unfortunately, because we have an education system that is very, very singular, it is very difficult for them to be able to get the best out of it. South Africa has, the technical schools, and then, you have the varsities, and then you go down to the secondary schools, and, but how many of those stages are practical? O'Brien, in your high school, Did you do some serious practicals that have
Uh,
led you
like
to the
none at all.
current entrepreneurship that you have? Not at all. So then how are you going to build that capacity? What you're then doing is that you're creating a position of having young people who are going to get out into the working world with one skill, and they cannot then be able to diversify in what they're doing. Of course, now then there's the whole AI conversation and whatever, but AI will never take certain jobs. They will always be there. AI is not going to go and mine down. It will be human capital that is needed. They things that you'll need, but you will need to have government incentivize certain catalytic sectors to be able to take up young people. And also, can we stop trying to think that everybody needs to get an office job? I think one of the biggest problems in Africa right now is everyone thinks that, no, after varsity, you have to be in an office. But then, what if I could be a very good farmer? But no, I cannot do the job.
Yeah.
There's this misconception about certain jobs that cannot be done by certain people. But then if they did, they would actually value add better than them sitting in an office. And if we don't change those mentalities, we are going to have this unemployment problem.
And so to kind of end things off, I want to ask you one thing. If I'm someone who's listening to this episode right now and I'm on the fence about coming to this conference, what's that thing that you would want me to know that, hey, if I come here, there's this opportunity that I might not be aware of that will make a difference to me being there?
I'm not going to do what everybody wants to do, which is trying to sell everything that I can. No, I'm not going to sell you guys dreams. No, it's not that. This is the thing. If you've been hearing, no, for real, if you've been hearing about embassies as a concept and what they do and how they can help you get access to different markets or get access to strategic partners in different markets, and if you want to understand and be exposed to other countries, we understand you may not travel a lot, but you're now going to find everyone in one space. You can ask them about what they do, how they are, because exposure is key for you to be able to understand the world in a different prism. You will have to be able to have these engagements. You will be able to network with people who come from different countries, who can give you a perception of where they come from, and maybe you can learn something. I'm not telling you that you're going to get money, to make a lot of money as an entrepreneur from this, but maybe you might realize that you have a solution to what they're looking for. And that's where your money comes from. Knowledge is always going to be power, and no one should ever lie to you that you can't. But for me, creating networks and having these conversations is where we can actually build the capacity for a sustainable continent that we want to grow. We all know you can never grow in silos. That's why in Africa they say it takes a village to what? To grow a child. So if you want to grow, go to the village. Talk to the people there. Understand your mates. You will find something to work with. So for me, I'm just being realistic. It depends on what your interests are, but I would like them to be exposed to the continent, and also allows us to take away this misconception about South Africa and the continent. You understand, especially in consideration of what happened recently. It is good for people to realize that there's less noise than they want to make it out in public. Come and see what other countries do, and maybe you'll be the one to want to go there as opposed to telling people to leave. It's a different conversation.
Perfect.
But
this is true.
The best way for you to get exposed.
Perfect. Well, I think that's the base part to end it with. So once again, if you're listening, I look forward to the next episode of From Garage to Growth.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.